Hello, everybody. Um, Continuing our lecture series on the development of a nation, the development of nationalism within the United States. We're going to look at a guy named John Marshall. Probably very few people have heard of John Marshall. If you have, excellent. But he was one of our first Supreme Court justices. And was instrumental in the shaping of how the Supreme Court would be administered and viewed within the American political context. So the first concept we'll be dealing with when it comes to John Marshall is to discuss the development of the federal court system and show how John Marshall played a key role in the development and contributed to the creation of the national identity in the United States. So that's the overarching question or prompt dealing with John Marshall. And concept 3.1 will basically discuss the development of the federal court system. So, in order to fulfill the demands of the Constitution for a federal court system, Congress passed the Judiciary Act of September 24th, 1789. The Judiciary Act created the Supreme Court, and it's staffed by a Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices, 3 Circuit Courts, and 2 Supreme Court Justices on each Circuit Courts, and 13 District Courts authorized to review the decisions of state courts. So that was the initial structure and charge of the Supreme Court. It also created the Office of Attorney General, as well as other miscellaneous offices necessary to run the new government. Example, U.S. Marshals or the postal system. Most important of all, the Judiciary Act provided for the principle of judicial review, by stating that all disputes over the meaning of the Constitution, federal laws, and treaties must be settled by the Supreme Court. There are basically 2 types of judicial review: reviewing the constitutional and the federal legislation using a loose or strict interpretation, and then reviewing state laws and court decisions involving powers and duties delegated by the Constitution to the federal government. Although the Judiciary Act created the principles of judicial review, it was up to John Marshall, the nation's 4th Chief Justice, to put it to use. Let's see. Okay, yeah. We'll get to concept 2 as well within this segment. So we'll make it a double concept. So this is concept 3.2. Discuss and demonstrate with court cases the significance of John Marshall in helping the American people develop a national identity. So again, keep that in mind. Through these individuals that we're looking at through this large lecture series, George Washington, John Marshall, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and Andrew Jackson, we're seeing how a national identity is formed. So right now we're looking at how John Marshall would contribute to that. Marshall's significance lies in the fact that he gets people to start thinking nationally as a result of his 34 years as Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Through his judicial interpretations, he helped cement the nation together by spelling out the procedure by which the federal courts could review state laws and state court decisions involving powers and duties delegated by the Constitution to the federal government. Also, Marshall's use of a loose interpretation in reviewing the Constitution kept the states from overruling federal laws and thus established the federal system on a sound basis. So we'll talk more about that later when we get to the development of the two-party system, but John Marshall would represent this faction of American political operatives who are loosely going to interpret the Constitution see it as a vague document and not have a very strict interpretation of it. So Marshal's contribution can be viewed by evaluating by a review of some of the most important court decisions. Mayberry versus Madison, 1803, Michalek versus Maryland, and Dartmouth College versus Woodward, both of those in 1819. An example of reviewing the Constitution and federal legislation is in the case of Mayberry versus Madison. An appointment made by John Adams in 1801 presented Marshal with a historical opportunity to establish the principle of judicial review. When William Marbury, whom President Adams had named a justice of the peace for the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., learned of his commission was being denied by the new Secretary of State, James Madison. Madison was appointed by the President, Thomas Jefferson. He sued for its delivery. Marshal knew that Jefferson or Madison would hardly spring forward to enforce a writ to deliver the commission to his fellow Federalist Marbury. He therefore dismissed Marbury's suit, avoiding a direct political showdown. But at the same time, he won a political victory by stating that part of the Judiciary Act of 1789, in which Marbury tried to base his appeal, was unconstitutional. Marshal said that the act had attempted to assign to the Supreme Court powers that the Constitution was not foreseen. In this self-denying opinion, Marshal greatly magnified the authority of the Supreme Court. Until this case, controversy had clouded the question of who had the final authority to determine the meaning of the Constitution. Jefferson and Madison in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1798 had tried to assign the right to individual states. But now Marshal had established the fact that the Supreme Court alone had the last and final word on the question of constitutionality. Examples of judicial review of state laws in the court's decision involving powers and duties delegated by the Constitution to the federal government are Michalek versus Maryland and Dartmouth College versus Woodward, both again in 1819. Both these cases bolstered the power of the federal government at the expense of the states. Michalek versus Maryland, the suit involved an attempt by the states of Maryland to destroy a branch of the Bank of the United States by imposing a tax on its notes. Marshal, speaking for the court, declared the bank constitutional by evoking the Hamiltonian doctrine of implied powers. Marshal thus strengthened the federal government when he denied the right of Maryland to tax the bank. With strong emphasis, he affirmed, quote, that the power to tax involves the power to destroy, unquote, and, quote, that a power to create implies a power to preserve, unquote. Marshal's ruling gave the doctrine of, quote, loose construction, unquote, of the Constitution its most famous formulation. He argued that the Constitution was derived from the consent of the people, and thus permitted the government to act on their benefit. So this is the basis of Republican rule. He further stated that the Constitution was, quote, intended to endure for ages to come, and consequently to be adapted to the various crises of human affairs, unquote. This basically feeds into the theory that the Constitution is a living document, as perceived by a very, one of the early leaders within United States history. A similar example was Dartmouth College versus Woodward case, in which Marshal and the court invalidated state laws conflicting with the federal Constitution and protected property rights against popular pressures. The college had been granted a charter by King George III in 1769, but the state legislature of New Hampshire had seen it fit to change it. Dartmouth appealed the case. Marshal put the state firmly in its place when he ruled that the original charter must stand. It was a contract, and the Constitution protected contracts against state encroachments. The Dartmouth decision safeguarded business enterprises from domination by the states, but it had the unfortunate effect of creating a precedent that enabled chartered corporations in later years to escape the handcuffs of needed public control. So this is something that kind of comes back to bite us. Marshall's decisions are felt even today. In this sense, his nationalism was the most endearing of the era. He supported a strong federal government and helped to mold a stable, nationally uniform environment for business, and thus ranks as one of the foremost creators of our existing national government. We'll call it quits with John Marshal on this one. Anyway, so again, yeah, make sure you have an understanding of Marbury versus Madison, Michalek versus Maryland, and Dartmouth College versus Woodward. And not just an understanding of the nuts and bolts of those cases, but how those contributed to a national identity and the federal government's role as far as its relationship with the states and how the states are being subjected to the authority of the federal government. Anyway, I will see you guys in the next segment with our boy Alexander Hamilton. Talk to you guys later.